see. Okay. Okay, well, welcome to a third class here at Advanced Biblical Theology. And we are really excited about having Dr. Casillas, Dr. Ken Casillas with us here today. And I'll introduce him in just a moment here. Before I do that, though, I do have a few announcements that I'd like to give to us. And you all are doing well in the course, and we're just excited that you're a part of it. But we also want to encourage you at the same time about a few things. Our stated deadline for switching from audit to credit is, and for paying, is January 30th. So that's coming up in, I guess, about 1 week or just a little less than a week. Today's the 23rd. And so you can do that possibly from our website. And if you have trouble with that, please let us know. Or if you want to do that through another way, please let us know as well. And if you're taking it for credit, we want to ask you to keep up with the quizzes and the readings. And even if you're audit, please, you're welcome to do that. The most you do with the class, the better it is for you as far as getting the most benefit from the class itself. So the last couple of lectures we've had, maybe you're feeling maybe a little bit overwhelmed. Maybe you feel like, wow, that's been just a ton of information that's been thrown my way, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you don't belong. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be part of the class just because the lectures seem to be maybe a little bit difficult or got into some things that maybe you were not familiar with. I think any time you take a class like that, it stretches you. That's really the nature of advanced training. I know there's several classes that I took in graduate school that I felt like after I took the class that I was then ready to take the class. And that happens often, so don't be discouraged by that. When we started our first year of PhD work, we don't, most of the guys there are green and just trying to keep up with everything as well. So you just do your best, understand what you can, and you will what you can understand from the lectures, and you will just incrementally grow even as you reach for something that's maybe difficult or concepts that you haven't really thought through more systematically, like we're doing here in this class. As normal, you have after class essay to take, and homework is posted for Thursday's lecture as well. And let me just say that, throughout the week, if there's anything that comes to mind, any questions you have, feel free to send us an email, and we'd love to help out. Maybe there's something we can do to make this course better for you. Again, please let us know, and we'd love to help out from that standpoint as well. Let me introduce Dr. Casillas. Dr. Ken Casillas is a professor of Old Testament here at Bob Jones University. And he is also a pastor of Cleveland Bible Church in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And he was actually on the committee for my dissertation. So I have high respect for Dr. Casillas. He teaches Old Testament theology in the seminary. In fact, I believe at 8 o'clock is when he would actually teach Old Testament theology, which would be 8 o'clock, which would be our second hour. And we'll talk about that here in a moment if we need to. Dr. Casillas is bilingual. He speaks Spanish fluently, and he's known to go and teach in Mexico and Spain, and really all over Latin America, teaching in Bible colleges and seminaries. And he really has traveled the world. He's taken short-term mission trips, taking young people on short-term mission trips really in Europe and really all over Latin America. So we are just so privileged to have him today and to be able to learn from him. And he is a thinker. He really is able to take really complex ideas and digest them and present them in a very meaningful way. So I think you'll really enjoy his teaching, and we look forward to what Lord has for us the next couple hours. And as always, you can just keep on the Zoom group chat. You can keep asking questions. We'll be able to take some of those periodically. I'll be asking or answering a few of those as well as we go along. So, Dr. Casillas, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. It's my privilege. I guess I'm going on faith here that you all can hear me. Can I get some kind of confirmation that everything's working?
You sound good for me, and maybe somebody can say something on the chat to say hello.
Okay,
yep.
Very good. I see a note there from Joel, so hopefully everything will work. Like Dr. Oberlin mentioned, I am actually in about an hour here going to have some students come, and they're going to be my normal Old Testament theology students that come at 8 o'clock, and they will just be joining us. You won't see them, but they will be able to see on the screen here in class what is going on. And it's very similar to the kinds of topics that I'm dealing with in that class anyway. And so it should work out well for them and also give them a different perspective on ways to get involved in the work of teaching and give them perhaps a bigger vision for what the Lord is doing in different parts of the world. I'm going to work with this now and see if I can't get my PowerPoint slides up. My intention here this morning is to sort of alternate between PowerPoint and then a Bible software program to pull up verses that we'll be considering along the way. So let me see if I can accomplish that here. And I assume that since on my end here, what I see is the slides. That is also what is on your end. And again, I'll go on faith that you can hear me, but I think Kevin has my email, maybe my phone number that he can contact me through my phone if there's any problem. So in the last lecture, Dr. Brian Collins had walked through a survey of the redemptive storyline of the Bible, and he gave a great overview of these themes that tie together the entirety of Scripture, walking you through creation, fall, redemption, and God's redemption coming to a consummation in the end. And what I've been tasked to do is to focus on some of that as it relates especially to the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. And there is so much that needs to be said if we were to try to be exhaustive here, but what I've decided to do is to kind of drill down on 2 areas that are big packages and some of the leading categories in biblical theology. I think Dr. Collins pointed out that as you look at the way the themes of creation, fall, and especially redemption develops in Scripture, the sort of backbone for all of that and the structures that God uses to advance that are a handful of key covenants. And maybe you remember these. They would be the Edenic covenant, though there is some controversy as to whether to actually call that a covenant. Nevertheless, it is still a foundational promise that gets the whole thing moving. And then you have the Abrahamic covenant. You could consider, even before that, the Noachian covenant as well. But in terms of the big categories would be the Abrahamic covenant, you have the Mosaic covenant, you have the Davidic covenant, and you have the New covenant. And of course, that all sets you up for what you're going to see of God's bringing about or beginning to bring about his redemption in a very concrete and climactic way through the work of Christ in the New Testament. So what we're going to be doing here is to look at 2 of those, the 2 that come from the Pentateuch, and look at a number of details regarding the Abrahamic covenant. And that'll introduce, I'm sure, a lot of specific issues and questions. And then we'll be looking as well at the Mosaic covenant, just giving you some big ideas to associate with it. And that also will lead to a number of specific questions as it relates to our lives today. So beginning with the Abrahamic covenant, I think we would all be used to thinking about the Abrahamic covenant as something very significant, very foundational, And you find that scholars will refer to, say, Genesis chapter 12, where this starts out. You find people referring to this as the cornerstone chapter of the Bible, or to the Abrahamic covenant itself as being the sort of outline or outlining the structure of the entire Bible. And those kinds of descriptions, of course, don't occur in the text itself. That's kind of our way of appreciating the significance that is there. But what I want to do here as we begin is to demonstrate that actually that is the role of this particular covenant, and to try to see how this is so interconnected with everything that comes before in the book of Genesis. And it is foundational for everything that comes afterward. And then we'll look at some more details about the covenant itself. So my first heading here would be problem-solution connections between the Abrahamic covenant and the early chapters of Genesis. And by the way, I will pass these PowerPoint slides on to Dr. Arnold, and he can post them on the Moodle website if he would like, if this would be helpful for you. So don't feel like you have to write down all of these points. What I'm saying here is that when we come to these promises that God starts to make to Abraham, and we see that the Lord is sort of zeroing in on this one man and saying all these things about his descendants and so forth, we shouldn't think that it's like the Lord is finished with everything that was said in Genesis 1 to 11 and kind of starting all over and doing something new. If you've been reading Genesis 1 to 11 carefully, you have been exposed to a number of problems that have been introduced into God's world because of human sin, and some very general things that the Lord has said about his intent to fix all these problems and to restore mankind to himself. And what we're going to see is that there is every connection between those problems that have been building up. And Genesis 1 to 11, especially 4 to 11, being largely negative in nature, emphasizing the desperate need for God's redemption. There's every connection between all the problems that have been building up there and what God is going to lay out with Abraham starting in chapter 12. So let's take a look at this. Even the word blessing itself, which is a key word throughout the book of Genesis and would make a great study in and of itself, thematically and by way of looking at key words for biblical theological themes, it is, I think, intentional that this idea of blessing is going to show up again. You had the Lord desiring, wishing, and pronouncing on mankind his original blessing. I think Dr. Collins pointed out that those imperatives in chapter 1, although they do reflect responsibilities that God gives to man, are really presented primarily in terms of God's blessing. In other words, this is a display, a showering of his goodness on humanity. And to a great degree, those blessings were damaged, they were diminished. I wouldn't say they were lost totally, but they were certainly greatly affected and slowed down and hindered because of human sin. And it's not by mistake that when the Lord comes along to Abraham and begins to talk to him about his intentions for him, really the climactic statement, we don't have the time to look into the grammar, but it's clear in the Hebrew structure of Genesis 12, 1 to 3, that the climax and the purpose of what God is saying to Abraham is that blessing would be restored to all families of the earth. So you see that connection. We could talk as well about, in that blessing of chapter 1, the responsibility to propagate and for the human race to reproduce. Part of that, I think, is just the practical measure that if mankind is to accomplish the work of actually ruling over all the globe, you're going to have a lot more people than just two, Adam and Eve. They're going to have to produce descendants so that there would be sufficient amount of human beings to cover the entire earth. And that is going to continue despite human sin. But again, there's a strong thematic link between that original procreation mandate and the Lord talking to Abraham about his seed or his many descendants, or that they're actually going to develop into a nation. That kind of terminology is used in chapter 12 and many of the other passages that are going to come on the Abrahamic covenant. And you want to see that link between the multiplication over here in chapter 1 and now how the Lord is advancing that specifically by multiplying Abraham into a nation. And then there is the actual dominion mandate, creation mandate, all creation blessing, all kinds of labels that are used for that mission that God gave to humanity to start with, that they would fill the earth, but also subdue it, to bring it more actively under their control, and to harness all of the powers of nature and the potential that's there to move it forward as effectively, as broadly as possible, so that God receives the glory as he is ruling the earth through these human beings. Well, corresponding to that, you have very specific statements in the Abrahamic covenant that God is going to give these people a land. In other words, this one group of descendants that are going to be multiplied, they're going to have their own plot of the earth that they will have the opportunity to rule over and to enjoy to the glory of God. And there's that link between the earth as a whole that was given to mankind as a blessing and the piece of it that the descendants of Abraham are going to enjoy. You have as well, this is an interesting point. I don't want to make too much of numbers in the Bible, but it has been pointed out by some that when you read the opening chapters of Genesis, there are 5 times that the word for curse occurs there, pronouncing the consequences of sin. And it's just an interesting fact that when you come to the start of the Abrahamic covenant, the word blessing occurs exactly 5 times. And perhaps there is a kind of a mirror image that these 5 blessings that the Lord is pronouncing are by way of undoing the 5 statements of curse that had come up before. Here's another point. When you read chapters 10 and 11 of Genesis and all that went on immediately before Abraham, there's an emphasis there regarding the division of the human race and how they are being spread apart over all the earth. And ultimately, we see in chapter 11 that happened not because really God wanted ultimately for the human race to be all divided, to be all separated, sort of establishing their own groups independent of one another and not having this harmonious relationship, but because it was a matter of a judgment from the Tower of Babel incident. And since humanity at that point is in rebellion against God, their unity actually ends up going against the purpose that God intended, and ends up contributing to their efforts to establish themselves as their own authorities and rebelling against the Lord. So God has to split them apart to kind of keep that impulse for rebellion and for autonomy under restraint to a great degree. Well, what happens when you come over here to the Abrahamic covenant is that in principle, all those families are able to come together again. They're coming together as they are united to whatever God is doing through one. And so even though over here and for the majority of human history, you find reflected what's in chapters 10 and 11, that geographically and relationally and culturally and so forth, there are all these differences, the emphasis is on the division. There is the anticipation that actually all these diverse groups are going to be brought together again, as there is one channel of blessing that's funneling to them all, being united to Abraham, and everybody getting the blessing through the same vehicle has the effect of bringing them together under God's blessing. Here's an interesting point. When you look at chapter 11, one of the great sins of the Babel generation is they said, we want to make a name for ourselves. We want to establish our own reputation. We want to establish our own rule and live for ourselves and become prominent and become well-known. And the idea of a name is their way of communicating that. And you can look at that and see the ambition there, see the pride, the rebellion against the Lord, and you could wrongly conclude that it is somehow sinful to have or even to desire a great name. You could conclude that it is inherently sinful to be prominent or to want to have some sense of value and importance that way in the eyes of other people. That would be a misstep. That would be a wrong conclusion, because what is another one of the blessings that God promises to Abraham himself, but that through the covenant, he is going to get a great name. And we see that in our day in the fact that here we are thousands of years later, still talking about Abraham, and he is so foundational, not only to the history of Christians, but of course to Jews and to Muslims as well. Here's a man who is prominent millennia after he has passed because of the blessing of God. In other words, there isn't anything inherently wrong about having a great name, reputation, status, value, worth, dignity, recognition, and all of that kind of thing. The issue is, how are you going to get it? Are you going to pursue it on your own for it to stop with you and to do it in your own way and according to your own methods? Or are you going to let the Lord be the one who advances you? Or are you going to let it ultimately redound to his glory as the giver of this name? And the Lord is not by judging those people somehow trying to squash humanity and humiliate them such that they don't have any value or even any recognition. It was something amazingly glorious that God had made humanity in his image in the first place. And mankind, by virtue of being in the image of God and being the vice regents of the Creator, we inherently have a great name. And we find that God is restoring that to man through the Abrahamic covenant, doing it himself for his ultimate glory, unlike the approach that was taken by the people at the Tower of Babel. And then we find specifically the emphasis on the word seed, in Hebrew the word zarang, which had been used back there in chapter 3, verse 15. And I think, again, Dr. Collins had referenced that passage and maybe explained some of the grammar there. But there is a kind of a mix there in chapter 3:15 as to who the seed of the woman is going to be. And in the first part of Genesis 3:15, it's talking apparently about the corporate seed of the woman, that is all believers who follow in Eve's train by basically acknowledging their sin and by faith re-siding with God against Satan. That anticipation is there that encompasses all believers. But then in the second half of the passage, there's a more individual aspect to it that is anticipating what later Revelation is going to fill out as the Messiah himself. Well, again, it's not by mistake that when the Lord comes along and starts talking to Abraham, where he could have used a word like your children are going to be many, and just leave it at that, he actually picks up, not just here, but in many other passages as well. I reference chapter 22, verse 18 specifically, that same word zarang. In other words, there's a thematic link, and this is just one verse. You find that the word seed is going to show up a number of times in the Abrahamic covenant. And if you're reading Genesis and recognizing that the author is using these terms to highlight certain concepts, and as the unified literary masterpiece, really, that is the book of Genesis, he intends you to make these connections. He intends you to see that the seed of the Abrahamic covenant is conceptually linked to the seed of Genesis 3:15, and to see it as the more specific way that God is going to fulfill what he's saying back in chapter 3. So hopefully that helps to see that we're not just kind of making this up to make the Abrahamic covenant such a big thing, that actually you have all these links back to the problems that were laid out and the beginnings of the solutions, and they're moving forward in a more specific way through the Abrahamic covenant. Now, that connects chapter 12 to everything that came before, but what about chapter 12 and everything that comes after? That's what we're going to look at next here, and it is to see that in the rest of Genesis, really everything that you're going to read in the stories of the patriarchs are going to be conceptually linked to the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. And so you see there the heading, some of these initial fulfillments of the Abrahamic covenant in later chapters of Genesis. And by the way, I will stop here along the way to see if there are any questions or to hand it over to Dr. Oberlin to make any other comments. But let me get through this point first. One of our great challenges in dealing with a book like Genesis and with any book that has to do with narrative is the question of how you get at the theme. Because most of your Bible stories don't come out and just say, the point of this story, the reason why I'm telling you that these things happen is to communicate this theological truth. You end up having to infer things along the way. You end up having to piece things together by looking at key aspects of a story like the plot and so forth. One of the huge helps that we have with the book of Genesis is that all of these stories about the patriarchs start out with this emphasis on promises. And what I would suggest to you is that as you study and as you preach through the patriarchal narratives, that you be thinking in the first place not about these stories being sort of personal biographies, where you're learning lessons about faith and about faithfulness, or maybe about the family or whatnot. I think many of those kind of moral, practical lessons are taught and are part of the total message. But I'm talking here about the dominant message. Those stories really are not fundamentally about the personal character of the patriarchs. They are fundamentally about how God is working in and through them to advance the promises that he had laid out with Abraham starting in chapter 12. And let me show that to you. This really helps with some of these passages, especially that are very difficult to nail down exactly what is the theme. You want to start by asking, what does this have to do with the Abrahamic covenant? How is this moving forward God's plan? Well, when we come to the Abrahamic covenant, one of the issues that we find right away is the word blessing. And blessing is multifaceted, but there is an element of that regarding Abraham's own personal greatness and the recognition that he does begin to receive even in his own life. It's associated with material wealth and God demonstrating his favor by providing not just bare necessities, but actually promising that these people would be well off, that they would enjoy abundance of material blessings in the land. Well, one of the things that you read about in the patriarchal narratives, you find these ongoing statements, and they kind of keep building and expanding, that this family, starting with Abraham, they're getting very wealthy, and they're being established as almost a small nation within the boundaries of Canaan, and they're developing a lot of wealth. All right, you can look as early as chapter 13. Why was it that there was this conflict between Lot and Abraham's people? Because they had too much stuff and they couldn't fit it in the small property that they were living in. So they had to branch out. They had to divide because there's just too many animals, too many people to sustain in those quarters. And you go on to read, what happens in this battle where Abram goes out and he defeats these kings. There is all of this wealth that is associated with him. In fact, he's got 318 servants. His household is expanding quite a bit to where he's got so many people that they form a small army, and they're able to defeat these mighty powers of the day. And then after all that's over, you have the whole situation with Melchizedek. Abraham feels no need to receive a lot of this spoil for himself or to be enriched by this pagan king, because he wants God to get all the credit. And the idea underlying that is, hey, I'm okay. I'm already wealthy. God's already given me an abundance. And you can trace through these other chapters. I'm not going to talk through all these stories, but my point is that those statements have a purpose. Anything that's being said about his material wealth is by way of demonstrating how God is fulfilling that promise. You have a lot of other things, many descendants. Of course, the big struggle as you go through the initial story of Abram is that he's an old man, his wife is barren, and there's this period of like 25 years where they're waiting on the promise. But eventually, after God, through these various quote unquote delays and struggles that are faced, working all this out for the very purpose of demonstrating he is the one who is providing the children, you end up actually with children being born. And it is not by just coincidence that the wives of all three patriarchs were barren. And yet by the end of it, they end up having children, demonstrating, given that they were barren, that this was clearly an unusual divine act done this way to make the point. These are not just normally born children. This is by divine intervention. This is by fulfillment of divine promise. And by the time you get to the end of the book, this family that started out with these two old people, you end up with 70 individuals going down there to Egypt. So you have that descendant. What about the land promises? Not a whole lot that's going on. Abram is pictured there as well in the New Testament as a pilgrim, and he is wandering around to different places. However, again, by way of a beginning of all of this, and by way of giving them a concrete legal foothold in Canaan, despite the fact that they're going to go for 400 plus years down to Egypt to sort of demonstrate that actually they belong in Canaan. By the end of it, they actually possess some small portion of the land of Canaan. Abram begins, and Isaac as well, they're involved with these other powers where they're making these treaties to demonstrate that they are recognized as belonging there. Then Abram insists on actually buying a piece of land where his people can be buried. And sure enough, you get to the end of the book and they're going back to bury Jacob. Joseph is saying, bury me over there. So the idea is that even though the people of Israel are still kind of waiting, in a waiting mode as far as the land is concerned, they sort of have the seed of it, a foothold in it, even by the end of the book of Genesis. That way of assuring the reader that the rest is to come. All right, we move on here. And what about the aspect of the covenant where God says, I'm going to curse those who curse you? It is amazing how that is being fulfilled as well. You think about some of these examples. What happens when the woman through which the seed was going to come is evidently threatened by Pharaoh, and he is tempted to take her, but doesn't actually do that. What happens by the Lord to stop it? Even though these people like Pharaoh and Abimelech were deceived into wrong treatment of Sarah, or wrong viewpoint of her anyway, the Lord has to step in, and at least temporarily, he makes their women barren. And it's as though he is, in principle, cursing those who are at least threatening to curse Abraham and his people. And this is, again, not a coincidence. This is all unfolding and fulfilling those promises. What about those Eastern kings that he defeated? Well, they were going against Sodom and the wicked of the world, but kind of wrapped up into that was Lot, who was related to Abram. And so God deals swiftly with them through Abram, and they get totally humiliated by this foreigner, not because there's anything inherently special about Abram, but because God had said, if anybody threatens the covenant people, I'm going to go after them. And what about that awful story in chapter 34? We don't want to justify anything that was done by the sons of Jacob out of anger and out of cruelty and the slaughter of those people in Shechem. We're dealing here with that age-old problem of evil, really, and the issue that often God uses man's sin to accomplish his purpose without actually condoning or justifying the sin. So I'm not going to stand here and say that the sons of Jacob were justified in going as far as they did to mete out justice for the rape of their sister Dinah. But I am going to say that as we back off a bit and recognize that sometimes God does use human sin to accomplish redemptive purposes or to demonstrate his loyalty to his people, you know, the people of Shechem, in a sense, they cursed the line of Abram through the rape of Dinah. and they end up in the providence of God cursed themselves. And so even what is a disaster and something very negative as far as the descendants of Abraham are concerned, we can see how God is using even that as a part of this plan. On the positive side, what about blessing those who bless you? Real quick examples here. We have Melchizedek receiving tithes from Abram. We have Laban prospering because of Jacob. And again, even though we're not going to justify everything Jacob did, that Laban did, there were these spillover blessings that attached to Laban that he even recognized. God has blessed me because of you. That's connected to the Abrahamic covenant. And then maybe the biggest of all of these is that when the nation of Egypt, Pharaoh, when he elevates Joseph to this position, he takes him out of prison, he listens to him, he believes the interpretation of the dream, promotes him to his position of power. All right, he is blessing the descendant of Abram. What happens? The nation of Egypt gets delivered from the famine. And actually, that's going to lead us to our next point as we consider the fact that Joseph is in a kind of royal position. You have specific statements in the Abrahamic covenant that the seed of Abram is going to include kings. And you want to take note of that, the emphasis on royalty, because that is one of the conceptual and key word sorts of ways that the Abrahamic covenant is linked to the theme of the kingdom in the Bible. The fact that it speaks of kings, and that of all this seed, it begins to talk about a certain line of them that are going to have this royal authority. Well, how does that begin to happen even in Genesis? If you ever wonder, why are there these long chapters about Ishmael, and especially about Esau and their descendants, when in fact they are not a part of the chosen line? Compared to everything else, they're really not that long, and it's like these secondary lines get fairly quick treatment in contrast to elaborating on the chosen line. But even they get a place, and I think part of it is to demonstrate that even in these secondary lines, they're not the main channel of blessing. The Lord is, by way of spillover, beginning to do this promise of royalty. You've got these whole nations developing, and they develop a certain amount of power, and there is royalty, or at least royal type leadership. Chapter 36, for example, talks about the dukes of the people of Edom. I would want to connect that thematically to the promise of royalty. But the big ones are later when you start to look again at the sons of Jacob, and the fact that Joseph ends up in a royal type position, and second to Pharaoh, and for all practical purposes, the kind of the king of Egypt, and really through that position exercising a kind of authority over the entire world of that day, and spreading God's blessing to all nations, material blessing, but again, in initial form, this is encouraging you that these astounding things that God had promised to Abram starting in chapter 12, God is capable of doing. When you see the amazing works that he accomplished through Joseph by the end of the book, into the third generation now, and that's just the beginning of it. And then as you move on in the life of Jacob, get to the end where he's giving those blessings in chapter 49. Another surprising thing is that despite all the emphasis on Joseph, actually Joseph is not the one that is designated as the royal tribe of Israel. And you have that amazing statement in chapter 49, verse 10, that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and unto him shall the gathering of the peoples be. And we recognize in that there is the identification of Judah as the royal tribe, and that God's kingdom promises, the royalty promises, are going to be associated with Judah. And it also anticipates a final phase in all of this. There really is still to come, even from our vantage point, where a single individual who's whose actual right it is to bear that authority inherently, he is going to come on the stage. He is going to rule, and his rule is going to spill over to all the peoples, not just to the nation of Israel. So my point is to say that the Abrahamic covenant really is the key to understanding the book of Genesis, and it is setting the trajectory for everything that you read in the Old Testament and into the New. It answers the problems that were laid out in chapters 1 to 11, and it begins to be fulfilled in small ways and in some very big ways in the very next generations within the book of Genesis. And we want to give it the place that it deserves. What I've sketched out there is just the development of the Abraham covenant in Genesis. We're going to go on to see here in just a moment that there are all of these other connections to the rest of the Bible, but maybe this would be a good spot to stop and see if there are any comments or questions.
Thank you. Great. Yes, maybe two things. The first is not necessarily a question, but I just want to ask you, how would you like to do this with the transition maybe at between 7:50 and 8 o'clock? Will students start coming in? I'd like to take maybe a little bit of a break in between there. What would be a good time to do that?
Sure. Why don't we, I could break, why don't we do 7:55? Is 5 minutes enough? I mean, we could do,
yeah.
It doesn't matter a whole lot.
No, yeah, just a couple minutes would be great. Yeah, 5 minutes is fine.
Okay.
Great. We did have one question that came in regarding the construction of Genesis 3:15. Maybe we could post something on that as well if we don't have time to get into that, but sometimes that can be confusing in the different translations. So maybe if you wanted to maybe just say a little bit more. I don't think we said too much about that, the actual construction itself.
Okay, let me, if I can pull up my text here. Do you see the biblical text there? Is that visible to you?
You know, I think you're going to have to actually hit the button share.
Oh, okay, I didn't hit share on that.
And let me stop sharing here. Okay,
You see it now?
Yes.
Okay, let me just pull that up here. So the Lord says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. So that's between the seed, the serpent, and the woman. And then he moves on to the offspring, between your offspring and her offspring. And some of this we don't really have a clear idea of until we go on to read some of later Revelation. But I think we'd have to say, based on the rest of the Bible, that this tension between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman, it doesn't start with Christ. And you have, for example, a statement, this is jumping way ahead, but it's really a good confirmation of what we would be concluding. Jesus says in John chapter 8, as he looks at the unregenerate Jewish people, he says, you are of your father, the devil. In other words, there is a kind of father-son relationship between Satan and unregenerate humanity, in the sense that the nature of Satan is reproduced in them. And I believe that statement about the conflict is a little survey, really, of the entirety of human history, that there's going to be this tension, this conflict between those who are God's people and those who are Satan's people. And you begin to see that even in the very next generation as you find the tension within the very first family between Cain and Abel. Cain being the first big example there of the seed of the serpent, and Abel the seed of the woman, in the sense that he sides with the Lord and he has faith in the Lord. He's a follower of the Lord. However, when it goes on to say, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel, when it says he shall bruise your head, in that statement, it's not talking anymore about the offspring of Satan. It's talking about Satan himself. And the fact that it narrows down from the seed back to Satan would suggest that the word he is also talking about some figure, a single individual who's kind of the climactic descendant of the woman, the sort of center of, or the ultimate expression of the people of God. And he is the one who's going to be able to crush Satan and win this battle once and for all. We see that suggested even in Jewish interpretations of this verse, where the Septuagint actually violates the rules of Greek grammar, and instead of using a neuter pronoun to refer to the word for seed, which is neuter, it actually makes it masculine singular. And there's a grammatical disconnect, but it seems to be that they were inferring as well that this battle is going to come to a head with a single male individual who's the ultimate expression of the seed of the woman, who will finally win this battle. That makes sense?
Yeah, great. Thank you for doing that.
Anything else?
I think that's it for at this point. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me see if I can go back here. I guess you're back to my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, very good. When we come to the issue of the Abrahamic covenant, probably the most controversial thing has to do with the issue of the land. And let me get to my slide. I need to click through this to what I need to be looking at. There we go. Within biblical and systematic theology, the real controversy about the Abrahamic covenant is not anything I've said so far, but it is how we ought to be considering the land promises specifically, and the degree to which we are concluding that God has an ongoing purpose for the people of Israel, and especially that they would be in some future date living in the land. And this gets to be a little complicated, and it's going to be related to specifically the question of whether the Abrahamic covenant was conditional or unconditional. And so I want to lay out for you various views on this and try to tie it in with some other things in Scripture. First of all, there would be those who would take the viewpoint that the promises to Abraham are or were actually conditional. And there would be various ways that they get from that to actually denying that in the future there would be a fulfillment of land promises for the people of Israel. And actually, they have some textual evidence for this that is thought-provoking within the book of Genesis. Consider, for example, that as one of the bases for these views, consider, for example, that when God first encounters Abram and he lays out those initial promises, they are connected with a command that he should leave Ur and go to the land that God was going to show him. And it raises the question, well, what if Abram said, I don't want to. I worship another God. I don't want to switch gods. I don't want to do something that requires such faith. We understand that, because God was intent on doing this, God would work in his heart and give him faith and all that. So we're not really worried that he would have refused. But when a command is given, there's always a choice to be made. So it would seem to introduce, at least theoretically, some element of conditionality to it. And yes, Abram fulfilled the condition, but it still sounds like a kind of condition. So how does that work into our understanding of the covenant? The even greater struggles that we have are more explicit statements in these other passages that I'm going to mention here. And let me just pull up those texts and have you look at the statements directly. So the first one is in chapter 17, where the Lord says to him, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. So it sounds like the Lord is saying, you need to obey me, and as you do that, I'm going to do something else. I want you to obey so that I may do this other. It says something like that in verse 9, where the Lord tells him, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout your generations. So the covenant there is not just a promise, but it is something that is to be kept or obeyed. He's got to be loyal to it. And then also in chapter 22, after he, at least in principle, obeys the Lord's command to offer Isaac, the Lord responds by saying, by myself I have sworn, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, multiply your offspring, so on and so forth. So he is tying the blessings, the promises of the covenant to Abram's obedience. And that seems to speak of some kind of conditionality. And then the Lord repeats this later on when he's dealing with Isaac and continuing the covenant. He says there in verse 4 that he's going to do these same things for and through Isaac. But why? Verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. So again, it sounds like the Lord is giving these blessings, fulfilling these promises because Abraham met certain conditions. So that is some of the exegetical basis for what these particular views do. And let me go back to my slides.
Can we have maybe just one question here?
Yes, go ahead.
Someone commented, what I've observed as a pattern is a command, obedience then the covenant, not a covenant with conditions and fulfillment of conditions. And they ask, is this correct from their perspective?
Obedience and then the covenant?
They saw a pattern of command, obedience, and then covenant versus a covenant with conditions and fulfillment of conditions.
Okay, well, that would be a good way to put it, but I would say that theologically, you're still talking about an element of condition. In other words, what if Abraham had not obeyed? Then presumably the covenant would not have happened, right? So actually, many of your covenants have some kind of human obligation involved, but it's the idea, does the actual enjoyment of or fulfillment of the promises, is it sort of resting on the conditions or on the obedience? Let's see, let me get back to it here, to my slides. So those are some of the verses within Genesis itself where they're getting this idea from. Now, the question would be, what is the impact of that on the land promises and what you make of the covenant going forward in Scripture? And actually, there are different approaches that these folks will take that at the end of the day end up doing the same thing and dismissing the future fulfillment of the land promises. One of them is that, basically, when you look at the story of Scripture, you get to the period of Solomon, which is kind of the high point of redemptive history in the Old Testament. There's some pretty intriguing statements there that actually there was influence, there was dominance of Solomon beyond the nation of Israel, and some language is used there about the border of Egypt and even up to the Euphrates. It sounds very much like what God had promised to Abraham. And so the idea is, look, Abraham kept the conditions, and God did what he said he would do. We find it here under Solomon. Now, actually, today you wouldn't find that many people who would hold to this view. One reason is that when you look at the way that First Kings states it, Solomon isn't actually actively ruling all of that territory, nor is Israel occupying all of that territory. But you have a kind of a tributary relationship. There are actually other nations within those boundaries that have alliances with Solomon, and there are good relations, even a certain amount of dominance in that they may pay tribute, but it really couldn't be said that this is all actively being enjoyed by, possessed by Israelites. You actually have other nations within the bounds. So that's kind of a weak view. Another idea associated with this is that in principle, the same conditions that were placed upon Abram in order to enjoy this covenant, the same conditions actually would end up getting repeated generation after generation, so that it is incumbent on all of Abram's people to keep these things, or else they won't enjoy it. And the ultimate opportunity that they had was to embrace the Messiah when he finally came. They, of course, as a whole, rejected him. And the idea is, at that point, these people are demonstrating their total disqualification. And then added to that, the idea that you find in the New Testament, I give you one key passage, Galatians 3 there, that there's some kind of a spiritual sense in which, because Christians, Jew or Gentile today, are exercising faith just like Abraham did, that we are actually called the seed of Abraham. And this is at the bottom of what are known as the supersessionist views, whereby the church, since Israel failed to meet the conditions, God sets them aside. He transfers this over to the church. We know that because of New Testament revelation is the idea. And so we're not anticipating the land promise anymore. But that position is often connected with the emphasis on conditions to start with. Or number 3, and this is a more recent way that people get away from land promises, is that you have in the New Testament some comments that relate specifically to the land promises. And let me pull those up with my software here, and we'll take a break here in just a moment. In fact, I guess we ought to go ahead and do that now since it's about 5 till. So you can.
Okay. Yeah.
You want to, if you need to say something, go ahead. We'll break till at least 8 o'clock.
Sure. We'll break to 8 o'clock. Sounds great. We'll just jump back in. Maybe a couple of questions when we come back together.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Well, he is transitioning right now. There's students coming in. You probably heard a little bit of the door open and close in the classroom there. And they are getting ready for what would be their 8 a.m. class there. And so they'll finish, and you'll probably hear a loud bell as well right at the 8 o'clock time, then we'll begin. And so this has been extremely beneficial. I see a couple yeah, good question. Joel put out here, how many of you here logged in would call yourselves dispensationalists? Would you attach yourself to that term? Small d, okay.
Let's
see.
Kevin, I'm taking care of something in class here. I'll be another minute.
Sounds great. No problem. Anyone else like to put down your overarching understanding of Scripture? Dispensational. I guess now you have four options, major categories, anywhere from dispensational to maybe more of a mild or a moderate dispensational, progressive dispensational, to a progressive covenantalism, to actually a covenantal position. Those are kind of the four major buckets that people use today. And it'd be interesting on the chat if you just kind of put where you feel comfortable with, or what you are accustomed to.
All right, I'm ready to go if you are.
Okay, great.
Another question?
You know, we've been discussing our big picture understanding of the Scripture through major buckets: dispensationalism, progressive covenantalism, and covenant theology. And people are kind of just putting their labels down. I wonder, just to kind of get a big picture from what we're actually talking about on the slides. We're looking at the land promises and alternatives to the land promises. And maybe just taking a step back, a question could be, why would somebody not want to see the land promises as actually the land? And why would they have these alternatives?
Well, to give them the benefit of the doubt is because they believe that the kinds of verses and arguments that I'm talking about biblically establish that. But there is another factor that you have these theological systems that are trying to tie together the whole Bible. And within covenant theology particularly, there is this pretty dominant trend to see so much continuity between the testaments that what is distinct about Israel, what is distinct about the Abrahamic covenant kind of gets swallowed up into the work of God in the present and into the new creation, to where you see this sort of merging of things, including the land promise to today. So I think to give them some credit, they would see some exegetical basis for it, but I think anybody would deny that some of it's also the system that they arrive to as they try to tie all these things together. The emphasis on continuity that also has a big influence on what they're doing.
Would you say that everybody has to have some discontinuity in their system and continuity?
Yes, and I don't think anybody would deny that either. In fact, I pointed out here in my class a couple weeks ago that to some degree everybody's a dispensationalist, because nobody's showing up with sacrifices to church, and they go to church instead of the temple, and they worship on Sunday instead of Saturday. So there are these clear distinctions and things that are left to the past. So everybody has some degree of discontinuity. But the question is, on the spectrum, how much and what elements of continuity versus discontinuity that leads you to the actual position.
So could it even be illustrated where you have like two knobs calibrated like on a radio dial, and this one has continuity and this one is discontinuity. And it's really your mix of continuity and discontinuity that really defines your system. You could turn up continuity a little bit more and turn down some continuity, or discontinuity you could turn up, or vice versa. And so as you play with those dials, that really kind of sets you within the parameters of a system.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to illustrate it. And everybody is doing that to some degree. It's really, it's really a bit simplistic to say I don't have any theological system or any position on these things. You do. If you open up your Old Testament and try to do anything with it, you're already assuming certain things theologically about the place of this old material to today. So our desire to have some kind of theological system is by way of trying to be precise and by way of trying to be consistent instead of sort of hodgepodge and ad hoc. So.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to a second hour here with you.
Okay, very good. I'm going to pick it up here, and I'm going to take this to 9 o'clock, so you guys can leave at 10 till if you want to, those that are here in the classroom. What I was talking about was some of this New Testament information that is read so as to do away with the expectation of the land for Israel. And one passage that's used a lot in our day is in Romans 4:13, where Paul says that the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. And you're going to read the entire book of Genesis and everything God said to Abram, and there's nothing that reads quite like this, that he's going to be the heir of the world. It keeps talking about the land, and it's very specific about the boundaries. So what in the world is Paul doing when he says heir of the world, like the entire globe? And the conclusion that's drawn by particularly covenant theologians is that Paul is here amplifying the land promise. And he's saying that ultimately what God had in mind was that for Abraham and his descendants, which is going to include Christians, believers today, was actually to inherit the entire globe. And they're going to see that as fulfilled in the new creation when God remakes the earth. And the idea is that the land promises, they were stated back in Abram's day, but really it was by way of a type or a symbol looking ahead to what is ultimately going to be understood as this bigger thing in the New Testament. And so this is one of the New Testament passages that they're using to broaden out beyond the land and to push this not so much to the church being somehow inheriting the land, but actually that these things are going to be fulfilled in their fullest sense in the new creation. And one of the other pieces of evidence is in Hebrews chapter 11, where it's talking about the land. And it actually says that that land was not Abraham's ultimate focus. In fact, here again, you would be hard-pressed to come to this conclusion based on Genesis alone, but the writer of Hebrews says that he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer builder is God, and that is, we would say, is talking about heaven. That was his ultimate goal. And so the idea is, again, that the land is typical of the new creation. That's where they were ultimately directing their faith, and therefore we don't need to be expecting that the land per se is going to come back. And along with that, particularly since we're in Hebrews makes a big point of once the substance is here, talking about the sacrifices, the shadows are done away with. So we're not supposed to offer sacrifices anymore because Christ, the fulfillment, has come. And the idea is don't be worrying about the land anymore because that was just a type anyway, and focus on the reality that it was foreshadowing. That would be one of the ways that that's handled, and probably the more typical way today. Let me go back here to my slides and keep going here. All of that was in trying to sketch out there the traditional conditional type views of the Abrahamic covenant. To come to the other side, your unconditional views, The first of which is the basic or probably most common dispensational view that is very connected to the land promises. There would be different ways that they would answer the sorts of arguments that the other side brings up. And by way of a starting point, their basis would be, for example, that in Genesis chapter 15, when the Lord is confirming these promises to Abraham, what does he do? He puts them in this kind of trance, and he carries out this ceremony whereby this lamp that represents the Lord is moving between the pieces of animals that have been killed. And that seems to be a self-imprecation, where as a way by which in these ancient times they would confirm a covenant is to have this ritual that the parties to the covenant would walk through these symbols of death, as if to say, if I should break my end of the covenant, may I become like these animals. A very serious way of committing themselves to meeting the obligations of the covenant. Well, in this case, seems to be following that pattern. In this case, Abram's asleep. There's nothing he's doing. The only one walking through the animal pieces is the Lord. And the idea would be, look, there are no conditions here. God himself is committing himself to do this. And so we don't want to be saying that somehow this is conditional on Abraham's obedience. That really doesn't come up here in the very ritual that is designed to confirm this and to formalize this relationship. So that's one of the issues. Then you also have the fact that when God makes these promises, including about the land, he uses the Hebrew word olam, which is traditionally translated everlasting. And this is one of the reasons why, another reason why we wouldn't see the promises as exhausted by the reign of Solomon, because it doesn't give it any ending point. Now, we have to look closely at the word olam. It does not inherently mean eternal. Really, the word just means a long period of time. And sometimes in the Old Testament, it's used for a long period of time looking backward, as if you would say ages and ages ago. Sometimes it's looking forward to a long period of time going forward. And it would be possible, actually, for there to be some ending point to this long time, depending on the context, that would keep you from understanding it as meaning eternal. When you look at the promise of the land, and you look at the passages that speak of it, we really don't find any ending point that God says, I'm going to do this on and on and on and on for a long, long time until this happens. You don't have anything like that. However, what you do have, if you look at the entire canon, is the promise that the present earth is going to be done away with, or it's going to be cleansed and reconstituted as the new creation. You read the descriptions of the new creation in the book of Revelation, and the world then doesn't sound a whole lot like the way the world today is structured. So is the new creation going to have a river Euphrates, a boundary of Egypt? How exactly is it going to look geographically? From what we can tell, it's going to be quite different, so that by necessity, those promises so specific to the world as we know it aren't going to be fulfilled. In the eternal state. That's a whole different phase. You're out of quote unquote world history as we know it. And so what we would say is the word olam at the outside limit would end up stopping when the world as we know it, where there are these geographical features ceases to exist. And so everlasting doesn't mean eternal technically, but it would mean indefinitely long until the earth ceases to exist as we know it, because there's no other limitations given to it. It just says for a long, long time, indefinitely off into the future. You might say a perpetual possession, or this is the permanent possession of the descendants of Abraham, something like that. And the word everlasting, I think, would lend credence to understanding the fulfillment of the land promises in the end. Number three, you have all kinds of other passages that suggest that God, even if they don't use the word land, they're still suggesting God is committed to the Abrahamic covenant as a permanent thing. And I've got a list of like a dozen passages here, but obviously it's going to be big as you continue in the Pentateuch. So Genesis 50:24, Exodus 2:24 is the incentive for the Exodus. Deuteronomy 4:31, of course, a lot of Deuteronomy is about setting up for going into the Promised Land. But let me go to some of these other passages so you can see that from an Old Testament standpoint, these promises don't ever go away. They continue to be emphasized and renewed, in a sense, brought back to the surface, continue to be the anchor of the hopes of the people of God. And let me look at Bible Works here and just show you some of these quickly. So 2 Kings chapter 13 and verse 23. In this age, but the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them. He turned toward them. Why? Because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, would not destroy them, nor has he cast them from his presence until now. And that's interesting because if you understand until now to represent the ending of the book of Kings, you are about halfway into the exile at that point when this book is wrapped up. And even though for the time being the people aren't in the land, the idea is, yes, they're going through this period of judgment, but God has not given up until this very day his commitment to the promises that he made to their patriarchs. A whole bunch of other passages. 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 16. David, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute to Israel, is an everlasting covenant. So David is hanging on to this as something perpetual. Psalm 105, verse 9. The covenant he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute to Israel, is an everlasting covenant, saying specifically, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. Obviously, it's going to feature prominently in the New Covenant passages, Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 35 to 37, Micah chapter 7, and verses 18 and following. In talking about the Lord's forgiveness, he says, you will show faithfulness to Jacob, steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. When you cross the line into the New Testament, we could look at the book of Luke and the statement of Zechariah after John the Baptist is born. He associates the very soon coming of the Messiah with these same promises. This is the language of Genesis, that we should be saved from our enemies, from the hand of all who hate us, to show the mercy or the loyalty promised to our fathers, to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, and so forth. And even after the work of Christ on the cross and his resurrection. This, in my mind, is a huge passage for thinking about the land promises, because the disciples asked the Lord before his ascension, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel, which is inseparable from the promise of the land? And this would have been the choice opportunity for Jesus to say, okay, guys, this has been transferred to the church, or don't be thinking about this anymore. Think about the new creation. He didn't say anything like that. He seemingly just assumes that the kingdom is coming to Israel in the way that they were expecting. And he just says, look, it's not your business to know when and how this is going to happen. This is all under the Father's authority. You just need to focus on the job I've given you at present, which is to be a witness to all nations. And, you know, the book of Acts launches from there. But he does not dismiss their commitment to a national kingdom for the people of Israel. And the same kind of thing, if you jump ahead to chapter 3 when Peter is preaching, and he says, you are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant God made with your father, saying to Abraham, in your offspring shall all families of the earth be blessed. God, having raised up his servant, sent him first to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness. And that is connected with some other statements here that don't mention the Abrahamic covenant, but that the Abrahamic covenant would be really at the bottom of when he says that they ought to repent so that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, that he may send Christ appointed for you, whom heaven must receive until the time for restoring all the things about which God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets long ago. In other words, he does not see whatever God is doing in the church age through the conversion of Gentiles and the expansion of the gospel to the ends of the earth. He does not see that as the complete fulfillment of what had been anticipated by Old Testament prophecy. He says, respond to Christ during this period when he is away. He's going to come back, and everything that the prophets anticipated is going to happen at that time. And one other passage that demonstrates a continuing attachment to belief in God fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant is what it says in Hebrews chapter 6, picking up on this idea of the oath and of God saying he would bless him and multiply him, and God confirming that with an oath, that it is impossible for God to lie, and that idea of God's commitment to what he said to Abraham is the argument for the faithfulness of God that the people of God today ought to continue trusting in the Lord and in his work. So these are just some of the passages that relate to perpetuity. That's how I would say the perpetuity of the Abrahamic covenant throughout whatever changes the Lord may have along the way. We go back here. We have walked through this, but we still have to consider how it is that these unconditional views respond to the sort of arguments that the other side brings up about what to do with the land promises. And let me share those with you. In my mind, some of these are more compelling than others. But for example, Walter Kaiser, in talking about Genesis chapter 12, he says, well, we shouldn't be thinking of this initial thing, go to the land I will show you, as a condition. This is inseparable really from the Lord saying, I'm going to bless you. In other words, God's already committed to do this. It's just like he's inviting Abraham to believe and to accept what has already been promised. So he's making a distinction there. His language is it's an invitation. It's not technically a condition. The other passages are a little bit harder to deal with because they say, I'm going to do this because you've done this or the other. And one of the things that is brought up is the centrality of chapter 15, and that no matter what those other verses say, the covenant itself has already been ratified in chapter 15. And according to Galatians 3:15 and just general sort of legal expectations, God's not going to add any conditions after the covenant itself has been ratified. So perhaps people could speak of Abraham fulfilling conditions, but this whole idea of these conditions now attaching to all the descendants of Abraham so that they must do something before God's going to do what he said to Abraham, that is inappropriate since the covenant has already been confirmed. They're going to add things to it after that. Then you have, this is the part I question with Kaiser especially, and it's an idea that we're going to want to keep in mind for the next covenant because I think it is a factor there, but that the conditions in the passages referenced there aren't talking about whether God's going to do the overall covenant ultimately, but whether specific individuals like Isaac, like Jacob and so forth are themselves going to enjoy the blessings personally. In other words, the covenant would still be conveyed through them as a medium. What is in question as far as conditions is whether or not they themselves are going to personally enjoy the blessing. I think that one for the Abrahamic covenant is a little bit hard to defend when you look at the actual wording and timing of these passages. Some other issues, as far as Galatians chapter 3, it is true that there's some spiritual idea that is brought up there, and that we are being told that God views us, in a sense, as being the spiritual descendants of Abraham and therefore connected to this promise. But the response would be that God can apply to us spiritual dimensions of the covenant. He's free to do that if he wants to. But the idea that that necessarily means he's abrogated what he actually said he would do for the original recipients, that becomes impossible to prove. In other words, it's a systematic theological implication that is drawn by certain theologians that becomes difficult to prove. It doesn't. The spiritual element being broadened out doesn't mean that God has actually changed the original promise. And then, what about that Romans 4:13 passage? I was struck by looking through Dr. Collins' notes that even though he's a dispensationalist, he actually agrees to a point with the interpretation that the Romans 4:13 passage actually does kind of amplify the promises. But even there, he's going to say what I just said about Galatians 3, that just because God amplifies it or brings out this broader dimension doesn't mean that he's undoing the original statement. He could come along and say, you know what, this plan is a lot bigger than what I had ever said, and the New Testament is filling you in on that. But that doesn't mean that when I say these things, I'm changing the more narrow thing that I actually promised in the original statement. And sometimes the way that view is put is that God can do more than he promised. The New Testament can tell you about that, but he's not going to do less than he promised. He's not going to change the original statement by other blessings that he is filling you in on later. So that would be actually one way to understand Romans 4:13. However, other people, dispensationalists particularly, are going to understand that statement, heir of the world, not to be referring to the land promise at all, but that's another way that we're talking about the descendants, the seed promise, because he had talked about his seed being as many as the sands of grain on the seashore. And he had talked about being a blessing to all families of the earth. In other words, you're talking about people. So that this idea of the world in Romans 13, according to some, would be referring to people of the world, not to the land specifically. So that would be another way that is handled. Now, actually, what I want to argue for here, and I need to hurry because I do have another section on the Mosaic covenant. What I want to argue here for is for some more recent efforts to try to wrestle with the language of conditionality in the book of Genesis. And the idea that in a sense it's conditional, but that basically the conditions on Abraham were met, and in response to that, God ends up promising certain things unconditionally. And it's more complex than that, because what they're going to argue, and this is people like amillennialists, so for example, T.D. Alexander argues this way, Williamson argues this way, but you also have dispensational people like Robert Chisholm who argue this way as well and end up with the land promise, okay? What they're going to say is that actually we shouldn't be thinking about the Abrahamic covenant singular as though it were one thing, but that actually there is a progression whereby the Lord is working and promising and responding, and you actually have two covenants that are made along the way. And let me sketch out for you what they have to say. Do you realize that in chapter 12, it doesn't say covenant? There is no specific covenant language there. It just says, go to this land and I'm going to do these things for you. Nothing formally like a covenant is confirmed there. God is just giving promises. And if you want, you can speak of going as a condition. And so I stated it this way, because the two are hard to separate. On the condition that Abraham leave his homeland and choose to be a blessing, which, by the way, that is an imperative, doesn't really come out that way in the English versions. But he tells him to be a blessing. And so going out and choosing to follow the Lord with the ultimate goal of him being a blessing to all families of the earth, God promised him to make of him a great nation and to make him the means of universal blessing. And what I point out is that those two promises, according to this way of analyzing the covenants, those two promises are going to get separate focus. Initially, in the next few chapters, the focus is going to be on Abraham personally being a great nation. And then secondly, in the second covenant, it's going to be on Abraham and his people's relation to the nations and this blessing concept. And it works like this. The first covenant is actually made in chapter 15 after the Lord specifically says that it's going to be a physical son of Abraham that's going to produce, that's going to be the seed. And you have that famous statement that Paul makes a lot of in chapter 15 and verse 6, that Abraham believed the Lord and it was reckoned to him righteousness. And immediately upon that, God makes the statement, right? At this point, Moses has demonstrated his faith. He has left the land. He has persevered through difficult seasons. He hasn't been perfect, but he has remained attached to the Lord and making progress in faith. And now specifically believing the promise that it was going to be through his own loins that this would come. And the Lord then turns around and says, all right, I'm going to give you numerous descendants. And it's at that point specifically that the land of Canaan is referenced with its boundaries. But the idea is he's met whatever conditions were laid out on him to actually trust the Lord and follow. And now the Lord actually makes these promises as a second thing that he's going to do and is committing himself to do permanently, because Abram has done what the Lord had called upon him to do. When you come to chapter 17, here's what's going on. God now is in a new phase, and he makes an eternal promise, and I've given you some of the verse numbers there, to make Abraham, now it's broader. Now it's not just your people, your seed, the nation. You're going to be the father of many nations. And of course, he changes his name to symbolize that. And to bless these nations through his seed. In other words, we're moving beyond what God's doing for Abraham's own people and broadening out, particularly in chapter 17. And then he gives them this rite of circumcision, which is something they have to keep, which is something that is the way by which later generations are going to affirm their connection with the promise. But you have the Lord commanding it to start with Abraham now, and he follows through and he circumcises his people there. That's the external symbol of the covenant. However, the Lord says there, he doesn't actually make the covenant. In fact, let me just go ahead and pull up the text so that you see the wording that I'm referring to here. He doesn't actually make the covenant as such in that chapter. Trying to get back to here we go. In Genesis 17, he says, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, may multiply you greatly. In other words, it's a future thing. He's coming to do it. And the first thing he says is, do this, and then I will make the covenant. And you read through this chapter, and the Lord makes some general statements about the promise, but it lacks this sort of formal confirmation, sort of ritualization that you had in chapter 15. He's still, even here in verse 7, saying, I will establish my covenant between me and your offspring after you for an everlasting covenant. There's some kind of future aspect that he is anticipating that he's going to confirm the covenant at a later date. Well, according to this understanding, the way that happens, going back to our notes here, is actually not in chapter 17, but it is in chapter 22, which is, of course, the story of Abraham offering Isaac, and that is the ultimate way by which Abraham is demonstrating his faith and is being perfect or whole or complete. That relates to the whole story of the progress of Abraham's faith to something that was kind of back and forth to something that is solid and mature or complete. He actually demonstrates that kind of faith in chapter 22 when he goes forward with God's command to sacrifice Isaac. And at the end of all of that, in chapter 22, God actually formally confirms the oath. Hebrews talked about this. It's that oath that in response to Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, God swears to fulfill the covenant that he had anticipated in chapter 17. And in addition to reiterating that Abraham will have many descendants, and that he's going to have this nation come from him. There is the additional statement that they're going to possess the gate of their enemies and that they're going to be the means of blessing for all nations. So remember, initially the covenant had to do primarily with the seed and the people of Israel. Now there's more focus on the broader anticipation, the broader ministry to the nations. There's this kind of progressive unfolding development of the promises. There's conditions to it. Abraham meets the conditions. After that, God makes these one-sided commitments, whether by an oath here or by the ritual of chapter 15, and therefore you end up with an unconditional covenant at the end of the day. Now, how is it that both dispensationalists and non-dispensationalists could agree that that's what's going on there? Well, it's because, and I would agree with this, that whatever you say about the land becomes very hard to, particularly if you're going to argue that it is broader or refers to something else, that's not something that you really could come to on the basis of Genesis. This is all related to how you're handling New Testament passages like Romans 14, like the Galatians 3. In other words, even a dispensationalist could say, in a sense, the Abrahamic covenant was conditional, but Abraham met the conditions, and therefore this is guaranteed. That talking about conditions doesn't necessarily make you a supersessionist or something along those lines. What actually drives that is the understanding of how the New Testament is using certain verses and certain aspects of the covenant, whether in fact it is transferring all of that to the church, whether in fact it is broadening it to the eternal state. This is not really an Old Testament issue. This is driven primarily by what they're making of the New Testament use of some of these promises, and then extending what is said there to sort of apply to everything in the covenant and change some of its features. All right. Questions, comments along those lines?
Wow, that was very helpful. Thank you so much for that. I don't see any actual question up on the chat right now at this point. I think we're just kind of following along and enjoying it and seeing how it's all coming together. I think it's a great illustration of what we had in our first lecture, of the idea of being able to just trace through these themes through the scriptures and being able to see them unfold in this progressive revelation. So thank you.
Right. All right, very good. We're gonna jump to the next category here, which is the Mosaic covenant. And I don't have as much detail in the slides. One reason is I didn't know how much time I would have left, and sure enough, I don't have much time. But I will do what I can here and share with you a number of concepts and scriptures. I have 5 main characteristics of the Mosaic covenant that will give us a good big picture of it. And then as we look at some of the details, you start getting into later scripture, the unfolding of this, and then understanding the connection to us today. So here we go. The first matter regarding the Mosaic covenant is fairly obvious, and yet an obvious point that we may not get the implications of if we don't stop and think about it. And that is that this covenant was made with a specific nation. It is national in orientation. It is very narrow to one people group. You can read Exodus 19, verses 1 to 3, Exodus 20 and verse 2, and the drift of the whole thing, and you find language there that this is something God's making with the sons of Jacob, or with the same people that he just brought out of the land of Egypt. In other words, this is very narrow to that circumstance and that people group, and we need to be extremely careful. Whatever we're going to say about tying this into today and tying this into the church, that this is for all practical purposes a national constitution. And as I mentioned already, everybody's going to have to recognize some degree of discontinuity. Just like in our country, we have a constitution. It would create a great deal of reaction, strife, warfare if a new president decided all of a sudden to start using the constitution of some other country as the law of the land. We understand that these national documents are very specific to a group and a circumstance. And it is inappropriate to just take one from one nation and all of a sudden switch it over to your country. We want to be careful not to do that. Reference to the church today or the United States of America or any other country. This is given in very narrow parameters. And it is said that this covenant is made with the physical descendants of Abraham. Now, hopefully we can assume that, but thought it would be good to make that point. But secondly, another point, and one that is missed often, is that this covenant was gracious in its basis. What we struggle with is that in the New Testament, there is so much focus, especially in the writings of Paul, on the distinction between law and grace as means of salvation, whether you're going to seek to justify yourself before the Lord by your own works versus trust in God's provision and accepting his grace. We're so used to that, and that has such a central part in our theology, that we then take a distinction that Paul is making about one issue, and we then apply it comprehensively to what's going on with the Mosaic covenant and its law in the Old Testament. Just let me make the point emphatically. This covenant was never given by Yahweh to these people as the mechanism through which they would earn salvation. This is a national arrangement having to do with the physical, earthly, political, governmental system. It was never designed, it was never presented as a means of eternal salvation. That concept, that application of it was something that developed in the theology of some people over the course of time, especially in Second Temple Judaism, that began to infiltrate the church through the Judaism of that time. And that is what Paul is actually interacting with. Paul is not interacting with how the Old Testament itself presents the Mosaic covenant. He is interacting with a twisted view of it by the Jewish teachers of his time. I want us to sort of bracket out the whole issue of Romans and justification by faith to a separate discussion, because that's just not what is under discussion when you actually read the covenant in the book of Exodus. It is gracious in its basis. And let me give you some statements. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, as the Lord is about ready to say, here's the covenant, what does he say? I have carried you on eagle's wings. What does he say in chapter 20? I have brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, I want you not to worship any other gods. This covenant is tied back to the gracious promise of God as the current expression of what he intends to do in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, which has already been solidified and which is a gift. And everything's presented in that broader context. They're not somehow earning the status of being God's people. They are responding to the privilege of already having been made God's people. But again, let me clarify. When we say God's people, we're not talking about a soteriological category. We're talking about the group of people on earth through which the kingdom of God is advancing in the world. And whether or not the individuals within that group were actually saved, that is a separate discussion. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 32 to 40, wonderful passage on the graciousness of God and making this covenant with these people. Here's another indication of it, that there is an emphasis on blood sacrifice in the very making of this covenant. And when the people commit to their side of the covenant in chapter 24, how is it that the Lord confirms it or ratifies it? It's through an animal sacrifice that's made, and it's through, if you can imagine this, Moses actually sprinkling blood on the people. And if you can just picture yourself in that setting, you're standing there in the audience, and you just said, I'm going to follow the Lord, all right? And Moses takes out this hyssop or whatever and just starts smattering blood, and it's falling on your face and it's falling on your clothes. What is this all about? The idea is that the blood is actually binding the two parties together, and it is communicating that at the bottom of this is the gracious provision of God for human sin, so that people can even have this covenant and enjoy it in the first place. It's ratified by the shedding of blood. And of course, a major part of the covenant is the ongoing sacrificial system. And there are a lot of classes of offerings, but at the heart of it are the sin offering type sacrifices that have to do with themes of atonement and that are about God providing for the punishment that our sins deserve. And so, again, all of this is speaking of God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's provision, God giving this to them as a gift. And we want to start there. However, there is an important sense, and this is, I think, a big difference in how the Abrahamic covenant was set up, that actually this was conditional in nature. Conditional in nature. And I'm going to go to one of these passages that I've already alluded to, where this all gets off the ground in Exodus chapter 19, and point out how the graciousness is presented alongside conditionality. He says, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So he's saying, look, I've initiated this, I've shown you grace, I've drawn you to myself. And then he says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. So how does that relate to the graciousness? Well, the Lord has worked to draw them to himself as a group. So in a sense, they're already his people. They already belong to him. And he's treating them differently from other people, not because they're great. They have demonstrated their rebellion already many times. But here they are anyway because of the grace of God. And yet he turns around and says, if you do this, then you're going to be my treasured possession. And here's how I would express this, that even though the fundamental basis of the covenant was a matter of grace, any individual generation of Israelites had to actually commit themselves to that covenant and demonstrate their loyalty to Yahweh by obeying. And that was not necessarily a commitment that they were never going to sin or disobey at all, because after all, the covenant included a way by which they could deal with their sin, through the sacrifice. But it was a commitment that we're going to take on this way of life that God has given to us. And so this is something that every new generation of Israelites has to wrestle with for themselves. In this case, it's not enough that Abraham did it, met the conditions, and we go on from there. In this case, it actually is something that has to be reapplied, recommitted to by every successive individual, every successive generation, and they're the first ones that have this opportunity. Now, in that regard, you have statements like Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 16, which say that the flip side of that is that this covenant could be broken. So it says at the end, they will forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them. And actually, Jeremiah 31, when he gets the new covenant, is talking that way as well, which covenant they broke. So with a conditional covenant, it is possible to break it. And even within an individual generation, what happens if they break it? Well, sort of woven right into the warp and woof of this covenant is also the idea that this covenant may be renewed. And you have an example of that right in the book of Exodus itself after the golden calf incident, whether you're technically saying, well, this is a different covenant or it's the same one renewed, at the end of the day, he's still talking about the law and the obligations that he's laid out in earlier chapters of Exodus. And he says, behold, I am making a covenant. And then he says down in verse 27, write these words, for in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he is sort of restarting it. And that's, I guess we could say, another part of the graciousness of it. Just because you break it once doesn't mean you can't be forgiven and brought back into it. And the whole book of Deuteronomy is an example of a covenant renewal. In fact, it also demonstrates that to the laws, God may add additional things that relate to specific circumstances. As the people are closer to getting into the land, he is amplifying and expanding on some things. But basically, the whole book of Deuteronomy is a kind of covenant renewal, so that they now will have a fresh opportunity to meet these conditions. Let me go back to the slides and continue our discussion here. The next thing I want to say is that this covenant is missional in purpose. And Dr. Oberlin can talk about that further, since he is the expert in Old Testament connection to the theme of missions. But what do I mean by this? I do not mean that the nation of Israel had the same obligation that we call missions today. However, they did have a purpose in the world. And it wasn't to actively go out and make disciples, but it is what is laid out in that Exodus 19 passage. Right after he says that you'll be my treasured possession, he says what? That you'll be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom of priests. So not just the Levites and the sort of official class of priests within Israel, but the whole nation has a priestly function. They have some kind of mediatorial role. And what is that role? And if they're a priestly nation, to whom are they ministering? And what becomes evident, particularly as you read on in the Pentateuch, is that they are actually mediating the knowledge of God to the rest of the world by means of their holy lifestyle. Those two concepts are closely together. A kingdom of priests, so the whole lot of you are an expression of my rule on earth that has a priestly function to the nations. And the way you do that is specifically by the holiness of your lifestyle. You have a teaching function, a kind of revelatory function. As you carry out this covenant, you are showing the rest of the world what life is like when people are under my rule. And in my mind, an even more clear passage on it is in Deuteronomy chapter 4, where he actually anticipates that the nations of the world are going to be able to see their holiness and be drawn to their God. So he says to them, keep them, verse 6, and do them, for that will be your wisdom and understanding in the sight of the peoples. But when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has God so near to it as Yahweh our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I said before you today? In other words, the Lord's desire was that the nations of the world would be impressed with the unusually high degree of righteousness, justice, morality, ethics, wisdom that the people of God are living out as they are obeying the law, and that obedience and the holiness of their lifestyle would have an attractive function because it is demonstrating to the nations of the world what they don't have. And it is demonstrating to them the value and the beauty of being worshipers of Yahweh. And that's what I mean by this obedience not having an end of itself of just this one people living this way, but it has this kind of missional purpose. Now, the final category is what gets us into the heart of this, I suppose, and the challenges for us, and that is that it is legal in its content. In other words, when you ask, all right, at the end of the day, yes, these general qualities of the covenant, it's conditional, missional, gracious, national, but what is really in the covenant? What are the requirements? What are the conditions? What is the content of this? Well, it mostly does have to do with law. It has to do with obligations of one kind or another. And here are some subcategories to hopefully guide your thinking about that. Number one, we don't want to think of these laws in principle as being something brand new. And Dr. Collins mentioned that we want to see, for example, a continuity between the things that are fleshed out in detail in the law and what the theologians call creational norms. And if we could just leave it at the very broad level of love God, love your neighbor, what Jesus said is the essence of this. All right. Was that something new with the Old Covenant? Isn't that essentially what God was expecting out of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? And if those are the two headings, and you can classify all of the laws specifically in Israel under those categories, what is this but a specific to a particular nation, culture, time, fleshing out of basic creational expectations that God has for the entirety of the human race? And you find little snippets of this, even about some pretty specific things that are anticipated as early as Genesis that people were already doing. Sacrifices. I mean, chapter 4 Genesis, Cain and Abel somehow know about sacrifices. Noah offers sacrifices. God tells Abram to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Nobody ever defined that terminology. Somehow they knew these things. Okay? How they knew them, I don't know, but I'm just saying that these categories aren't just being created out of the air when you come to the Mosaic Covenant. Even something like the clean and unclean laws. Back in Genesis, when the Lord's talking to Noah way back then, he says, I want you to deal with the clean animals. So even that distinction is known in early times. The law against murder, chapter 9, verse 6, and capital punishment of Genesis. When it talks about Abraham in Genesis 26:5, one of the verses I read on that whole conditionality discussion, it said that Abraham kept my commandments, statutes, laws. And those are terms that we associate with the law of Moses, but actually God had commandments, statutes, laws under the time of Abraham. In chapter 18 and chapter 20 of Leviticus, there are all these sexual aberrations that are prohibited for the people of Israel. And yet the Lord turns around and says, look, anybody that does this is an abomination to me, and this is why I am spewing out the Canaanites from the land through the conquest, because they didn't keep these laws of morality. And you're like, well, how were they supposed to know that these things were wrong? Was there a law? Well, we don't know all the answers to that question, but I think on the basis, and again, Dr. Collins referenced this in his notes, on the basis of Romans 2 and the idea of natural law and the conscience of man, those people should have known that those things were wrong. And again, we see that God isn't just making up this stuff for the first time. There's all kinds of evidence that he is applying to them ethics and even matters of worship that were somehow known in earlier times, and he's just bringing it out for their circumstances. We could also talk about this, that the law encompassed both general principles and specific regulations. Even at the outset, you've got the 10 Commandments, which would be hard in some cases to really enforce that by a court of law and to condemn people on a legal basis. These really, some of them don't have the character of a law. They're more these broad moral imperatives. But then you go right away into Exodus chapter 20, starting verse 22, into what's called the Book of the Covenant, sort of the initial applications of those principles to specific questions of civics and government and sexuality and family and so forth. And those are a lot more narrow. And those two we want to keep together. We want to see that the specifics, again, aren't just all these picayunish things that the Lord is listing sort of randomly, but they are ways of working out in more particular ways the kinds of things that he had said in more principial terms earlier, which becomes very helpful for us as we get to our last point and think about our situation today. Let me say this, and we're out of time here, but very important to recognize that even the Old Testament anticipates that this law, the part of this covenant, the only way that somebody can do it is not because of the covenant itself. The covenant law is just a list of rules. It is not a power and does not have power to enable the people to obey. And you have as early as Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6, the expectation that it's going to be in the future that God's going to circumcise the hearts of the bulk of the people of Israel, that they might be able to obey these things. And that leads us ultimately to the new covenant that you'll be hearing about later. But what I want to point out is that it's not a new thing that these people were failing and needed something better. This is actually embedded right in the old covenant, that they are not able themselves to do these things. In other words, the old covenant has the seeds of its own abolition eventually, because it tells you that this is an impossible thing apart from something else of God doing in the hearts of these people. And actually, God did do the work in the hearts of those people. I would call it a sort of advanced enjoyment of some of the blessings of the new covenant that people like Moses, that people like David, who actually delighted in the law of the Lord, that people like Zechariah and Elizabeth, who said to walk blamelessly in the commandments of the Lord, they had an advanced enjoyment. Individuals could have an advanced enjoyment of regeneration in their hearts that enabled them to obey the law that had been laid out in the old covenant. And then, as it relates to today, this is the way that I would like to encourage you to think about the law, is not that this is our covenant, not that this is brought forward in an unfiltered way to the New Testament, but that it all continues to be revelatory of the mind and the thinking and the values and the ethics of God, and that we take this ancient revelation and we derive from it patterns that we then apply to a new culture and a new circumstance that is different from what Israel faced. You have a lot of examples where the New Testament itself guides you in that regard, 1 Corinthians 9, Ephesians chapter 6, and so forth, but we're going to have to cut it off here.
Wow, thank you so much. This is great. Maybe just one question for you.
Sure.
Would you say that, or how would you, if you're just looking back at on the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant that we've talked about today, what are some things that you would say in conjunction between the covenants? Is the Mosaic covenant should I say it this way, that Abrahamic covenant, is it have greater relevance for the New Testament believer than the Mosaic covenant? And if so, why is that?
I would say yes, for sure. And that's because the Abrahamic covenant is fundamentally a promissory covenant that is sketching out the big picture of God's redemption.
Yeah.
The Mosaic covenant is not, it's different from Abrahamic, Davidic, and New Covenant, because it's not really a promissory type covenant. It is a national political, by definition, temporary arrangement. And so it really does have a secondary status to the bigger issue of the Abrahamic covenant.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you. And we will go ahead and sign off, and I got to get to another class here.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.